They didn't break you. You broke yourself, trying to keep people who were never meant to stay. Let that sink in. Because the brutal truth about self-worth is this: no one can make you feel worthless unless you secretly agree with them. Every interaction you have with the world is shaped by something deeper than words: your patterns, your reactions, your tolerance levels, and the silent agreements you make with how others treat you. Most people believe that respect, love, and value come from others as if they are granted externally based on luck or circumstance. But in reality, what you experience repeatedly is often a reflection of what you have unconsciously allowed, reinforced, or failed to challenge within yourself. The world is constantly observing not just what you say, but what you accept, what you ignore, and what you normalize. When you stay silent in moments where you feel disrespected, you send a message that such behavior is acceptable. Not because you explicitly approve of it, but because your lack of response becomes permission. Over time, this silence turns into a pattern, and that pattern becomes your identity in the eyes of others. People begin to assume that crossing your boundaries is normal, that your needs are flexible, and that your presence does not require careful consideration. This is not always done with malicious intent. Often, it is simply human nature responding to the signals you consistently give. Unconscious teaching happens in subtle ways. It's in the way you laugh off things that hurt you, the way you explain your boundaries to avoid conflict, and the way you prioritize being liked over being respected. Each of these behaviors communicates something powerful: that your comfort is negotiable. And once the world senses that, it adjusts accordingly. People will take more, expect more, and give less, not necessarily because they are bad, but because you have shown them that this imbalance is sustainable. At the core of this dynamic is a deeper issue: the relationship you have with yourself. If you struggle to recognize your own worth, it becomes difficult to demand it from others. If you doubt your value, you may settle for less than you deserve, convincing yourself that it's the best you can get. This internal belief system doesn't stay hidden. It leaks into your actions, your tone, your decisions, and ultimately, your experiences. The world mirrors back what you believe about yourself, amplifying it through the way others respond to you. Breaking this cycle requires awareness before action. You have to start noticing the patterns you've been repeating without realizing it. Where do you feel drained but continue to give? Where do you feel disrespected but remain silent? Where do you say yes when everything inside you is saying no? These moments are not random, they are clues. They reveal the areas where you have been unconsciously teaching others how to treat you. Changing this doesn't mean becoming aggressive or confrontational. It means becoming clear and consistent. It means understanding that every boundary you set is not just about protecting your space, but about redefining your value in the eyes of others. When you begin to respond differently, when you speak up, when you walk away, when you stop overgiving, you interrupt the old pattern. At first, this may feel uncomfortable, even unnatural, because it goes against what you've been conditioned to do. But discomfort is often the first sign that something is shifting. As you start to hold yourself to a higher standard, the world begins to adjust. Some people will rise to meet your new expectations, while others will fall away. This is not a loss, it is a realignment. You are no longer available for the dynamics that once defined you, And that creates space for healthier, more balanced connections to enter your life. The way people treat you begins to change, not because they suddenly decided to respect you, but because you stopped accepting anything less. Most people spend their lives trying to understand why they feel empty, why relationships keep hurting them, and why no matter how much they give, it never seems to be enough. They search for answers in the behavior of others, in past betrayals, or in unfortunate circumstances. But the deeper truth is far more uncomfortable. The greatest source of pain is not what others have done to you, but the ways you have learned to abandon yourself in order to survive, to belong, or to be accepted. Self-abandonment doesn't always look dramatic. It often hides behind what seems like kindness, patience, or sacrifice. It appears when you ignore your own needs to keep the peace, when you silence your voice to avoid conflict, and when you reshape yourself into someone more acceptable just to avoid rejection. Over time, these small moments accumulate. They form a pattern where your inner world becomes secondary, where your feelings are dismissed before anyone else even gets the chance to dismiss them. At the heart of self-abandonment is fear. The fear of being alone, the fear of not being enough, the fear of losing connection. These fears are powerful because they are tied to something deeply human, the need to belong. So you compromise, you tell yourself it's not a big deal. You convince yourself that your needs are too much, your expectations too high, or your feelings too inconvenient. And in doing so, you slowly disconnect from who you truly are. This disconnection creates a quiet kind of pain. It's not always loud or obvious, but it lingers. It shows up as resentment that you can't fully explain, as exhaustion that rest doesn't fix, and as a sense of emptiness, even when you're surrounded by people. You may find yourself giving more and more, hoping that eventually it will be enough to feel valued, but no amount of external validation can fill the space created by abandoning yourself. What makes self-abandonment particularly damaging is that it teaches others how to treat you. When you consistently put your needs aside, you signal that they are not important. When you tolerate behavior that hurts you, you normalize it. People begin to interact with you based on the version of you that you present, the one who overextends, who forgives too quickly, who asks for very little. This dynamic reinforces the cycle, making it even harder to break free. There is also an internal cost. Every time you ignore your intuition, you weaken your trust in yourself. Every time you say yes when you mean no, you create a gap between who you are and how you show up. Over time, this gap grows, and with it comes confusion. You may start to lose clarity about what you actually want, what you believe, and what you deserve. The more you abandon yourself, the more distant you become from your own identity. Breaking this pattern requires a shift in awareness. It begins with recognizing that your needs are not a burden, your feelings are not a weakness, and your boundaries are not something to apologize for. It means paying attention to the moments where you feel uncomfortable, where something feels off, and choosing to honor that instead of dismissing it. This can feel unfamiliar, especially if you've spent a long time prioritizing others over yourself. Reconnecting with yourself involves small but consistent changes. It's in allowing yourself to pause before agreeing to something that doesn't feel right. It's in expressing your thoughts honestly, even when your voice shakes. It's in giving yourself permission to take up space without guilt. These actions may seem minor, but they represent a fundamental shift from abandoning yourself to standing with yourself. As you begin to show up differently, you may notice resistance, both internally and externally. There may be moments of doubt where old patterns try to pull you back into familiar roles. There may also be people who are uncomfortable with the change, not because it's wrong, but because it disrupts the dynamic they were used to. This resistance is part of the process, a reflection of the shift that is taking place. The pain that once felt confusing starts to make sense when you see it through this lens. It becomes clear that it wasn't just about what happened to you, but about how often you left yourself in those moments. And in that awareness, there is also a kind of power, the realization that what was learned can be unlearned, and what was neglected can be reclaimed. There is a quiet force that shapes most people's lives, not through what they face, but through what they avoid. It operates beneath the surface, influencing decisions, reactions, and patterns without ever being directly acknowledged. This force is made up of everything you refuse to confront: your fears, your wounds, your insecurities, and the truths you would rather not see. What remains unexamined does not disappear. It settles into the background and begins to direct your life in ways you may not even recognize. Avoidance often feels like protection. When something is painful, confusing, or overwhelming, the instinct is to move away from it, to distract yourself, or to pretend it doesn't matter. This might work temporarily, creating a sense of relief or control. But beneath that surface, the unresolved issue continues to exist. It doesn't lose its power just because you refuse to look at it. In fact, it often grows stronger because it remains unchallenged and undefined. What you avoid begins to shape your behavior in subtle but consistent ways. A fear of rejection that is never confronted can lead you to people please, to overextend yourself, or to avoid meaningful connections altogether. An unaddressed sense of inadequacy can push you to seek constant validation, or to hold yourself back from opportunities that require confidence. Past experiences that were never processed can influence how you interpret present situations, causing you to react not to what is happening now, but to what once happened before. This is how control develops. It doesn't come from the external situation alone, but from the internal response that has been left unchecked. When you refuse to confront something, you give it the space to operate freely without awareness or resistance. It becomes a hidden script that runs in the background, shaping your choices and reinforcing the same outcomes over and over again. One of the most difficult aspects of this process is that it often feels normal. The patterns created by avoidance become familiar, and familiarity can be mistaken for identity. You may begin to believe that you are simply this kind of person, someone who struggles with boundaries, someone who fears change, someone who settles for less. But these are not fixed traits. They are patterns formed around things that were never confronted. Confrontation, in this sense, is not about conflict with others. It is about honesty with yourself. It requires a willingness to look at what you have been avoiding, even when it is uncomfortable or unsettling. This might mean acknowledging emotions you've tried to suppress, recognizing behaviors that are no longer serving you, or admitting truths that challenge how you see yourself and your life. There is a certain clarity that comes with facing what you've been avoiding. When something is brought into awareness, it becomes defined. It is no longer an undefined force influencing you from the shadows, it becomes something you can understand, question, and ultimately change. This doesn't mean the process is easy. Confronting what you've avoided can bring up resistance, discomfort, and even fear. But these reactions are part of the process of breaking the control that avoidance has created. As you begin to confront these internal realities, your responses start to shift. Instead of reacting automatically, you gain the ability to choose how you respond. Instead of being driven by unconscious patterns, you become aware of them. This awareness creates space, and in that space, there is the possibility of change. The things you once avoided begin to lose their hold, not because they disappear, but because they are no longer operating without your awareness. You start to see the connections between your past experiences, your current behaviors, and the outcomes you've been experiencing. This understanding allows you to make different choices, to respond differently, and to gradually reshape the patterns that once controlled you. Control does not come from eliminating difficulty or discomfort. It comes from facing it directly, from allowing yourself to see what is real rather than what is convenient. The more willing you are to confront what you've been avoiding, the less power it has over you, and the more control you regain over your own life. There comes a point in life where you begin to see things more clearly, people, patterns, and most importantly, yourself. What once felt normal starts to feel heavy. What you once tolerated begins to feel like a quiet betrayal of your own standards. And in that moment of clarity, a difficult choice presents itself: continue maintaining connections that cost you your peace, or walk away and face the uncertainty that follows. This is where self-respect begins, and with it often comes a kind of loneliness that many are not prepared for. Loneliness in this context is not simply the absence of people. It is the absence of familiar dynamics, even if those dynamics were unhealthy. When you start setting boundaries, saying no, and refusing to accept what no longer aligns with your values, you disrupt the expectations others have of you. People who are comfortable with the version of you that overgave, that stayed silent, or that made things easy may not know how to respond to this change. Some will resist it, others will distance themselves, and some will leave altogether. This shift can feel unsettling. There is a natural desire to belong, to feel connected, and to be understood. When those connections begin to change or disappear, it can create a sense of isolation. You may question your decisions, wondering if you were too harsh, too distant, or too different. The silence that replaces familiar noise can feel heavy, and the absence of certain people can make you doubt whether choosing yourself was the right decision. But this loneliness is not a sign that something has gone wrong. It is a reflection of something that has changed within you. You are no longer willing to participate in dynamics that require you to compromise your self-worth. You are no longer willing to ignore your needs or tolerate behavior that diminishes you. This creates a gap between who you used to be and who you are becoming, and in that gap, there is often a period of solitude. What makes this experience challenging is that it requires you to sit with yourself in a way you may not have before. Without the distractions of unhealthy relationships or constant external validation, you are left with your own thoughts, your own feelings, and your own sense of identity. This can be uncomfortable, especially if you have spent a long time defining yourself through others, but it is also where something important begins to take shape. In this space, You start to rebuild your relationship with yourself. You begin to understand what you truly value, what you need, and what you are no longer willing to accept. You learn to validate your own feelings instead of relying on others to do it for you. This process is not immediate, and it is not always easy. There may be moments where the loneliness feels overwhelming, where the temptation to return to old patterns is strong. Familiar discomfort can feel easier than unfamiliar growth. However, returning to what once felt normal often means returning to the very patterns that led to the need for change in the first place. It means sacrificing your self-respect for the sake of comfort. And that comes with its own kind of pain, one that is often deeper and more lasting than loneliness. The difference is that loneliness, while difficult, is temporary and transformative, while the loss of self-respect tends to create a cycle that repeats itself. As you continue to hold your boundaries and honor your values, something begins to shift. The loneliness starts to feel less like emptiness and more like space, space for healthier connections, space for growth, and space for a more authentic version of yourself to emerge. The people who enter your life during or after this period are more likely to align with who you truly are rather than who you felt you had to be. This process requires patience and a willingness to tolerate discomfort. It asks you to trust that what you are building is worth what you are leaving behind. It challenges you to redefine connection, not as something that requires you to lose yourself, but as something that supports and respects who you are becoming. There is a fundamental truth that many people struggle to fully accept. Your value as a person is not something that can be increased, decreased, or negotiated by others. It is inherent. It exists regardless of opinions, approval, or rejection. Yet despite this, the way you behave often sends a very different message to the world. Through your actions, your tolerance, and your patterns, you can unintentionally make it seem as though your value is flexible, as though it can be bargained, tested, or even overlooked. This contradiction is where much of the confusion begins. On one hand, you may believe that you deserve respect, honesty, and consideration. On the other hand, your behavior may communicate that you are willing to accept less. This gap between belief and action creates a mixed signal, not only for others, but also for yourself. People respond more to what you demonstrate than to what you declare, and over time, your actions become the standard by which you are treated. One of the most common ways this shows up is through overcompensation. You give more than is asked, you try harder than necessary, and you extend yourself beyond your limits in order to prove your worth. This often comes from a fear that if you don't, you will be overlooked or replaced. But instead of reinforcing your value, it can have the opposite effect. When you consistently overgive, it creates an imbalance where your effort is expected rather than appreciated, and your presence is taken for granted rather than respected. Another way your behavior can make your value seem negotiable is through inconsistency with boundaries. You may set a boundary in one moment only to relax it in the next when faced with pressure, guilt, or the fear of losing someone. This inconsistency sends a message that your limits are flexible, that they can be pushed or ignored without real consequence. Over time, this erodes the seriousness of your boundaries, making it more likely that they will continue to be tested. Seeking validation is another pattern that can unintentionally lower how your value is perceived. When you rely heavily on external approval to feel secure, you place others in a position of authority over your self-worth. This dynamic can lead to behaviors like constantly seeking reassurance, changing yourself to fit expectations, or tolerating situations that don't align with your values just to maintain acceptance. In doing so, you give the impression that your worth is dependent on how others respond to you. There is also a subtle but powerful impact in how you handle disrespect or misalignment. When you ignore behavior that doesn't sit right with you, or when you rationalize it to avoid confrontation, you create a precedent. It signals that such behavior does not carry consequences, that it is something you are willing to endure. This doesn't necessarily come from a lack of awareness, but often from a desire to maintain harmony or avoid discomfort. However, the cost of that harmony is often your own sense of self-respect. Shifting this dynamic requires more than simply believing in your value. It requires aligning your behavior with that belief. This means making choices that reflect self-respect, even when they are difficult or uncomfortable. It means recognizing that not every opportunity, relationship, or situation deserves your energy, and being willing to step back when something doesn't align with your standards. Consistency plays a key role in this process. When your actions consistently reflect your values, it creates clarity. Others begin to understand what you will and will not accept, not because you have to repeatedly explain it, but because it is evident in how you show up. This consistency reinforces your boundaries and reduces the likelihood of them being challenged. There is also a shift that happens internally. As you begin to act in alignment with your worth, your sense of self becomes more stable. You rely less on external validation and more on your own standards. Decisions become clearer, not because they are easier, but because they are grounded in a stronger understanding of what you deserve and what you are willing to accept. Your value does not change based on how others treat you, but the way you allow yourself to be treated can shape how that value is recognized and respected. When your behavior reflects self-respect, it naturally sets a standard that others are either willing to meet or not. And that distinction becomes clearer over time.